Today's podcast is going to talk about the new news in dealer compliance for 2022. With me today is the president of Armed, Mike Tuno. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Mike. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Well, thank you for coming. Let's talk about this. All dealerships this year must comply with the updates to the safeguard rule. Is that correct?
That is correct. The one caveat to the updates, but hasn't really changed, the original 2003 filing or rule for the safeguard rule is 5,000 customers. That threshold puts this new update really squarely into the lap of dealers who have 5,000 customers. So that's service, parts, sales, which frankly is the vast majority of them, to your point. It doesn't really change some of the requirements from the 2003 rule.
Perfect. You know, in our conversations, Mike, we've talked a little bit about some of these things that dealers absolutely have to comply with this year. One of them was appointing a qualified person to oversee all of the safeguard rules. Could you elaborate on that for me, please?
Sure. What the FTC has done differently now, since they released the rule in October of 2021 with compliance to the rule by December 9, 2022, is they really narrowed in on or honed in on this definition of a qualified individual. That term individual or person responsible for managing and overseeing the safeguard rule for a dealership has always been there. What they've done is they added a descriptive, and the descriptive is qualified. So our interpretation of that means that they're serious about it. They want someone who understands the law, understands the inner workings of the dealership, and is capable and competent to be able to conduct adherence to the safeguard rule, not only from 2003, but the updates. So the new news for 2022, which you described as you opened up this session. So qualified is important. And so, you know, what we have attempted to do all along with ARM is to provide the resources for dealers so that they could appoint a person that has skill sets like attention to detail, has the ear and the authority of either the owner or the executive board to perform this duty. And so we've provided training to make sure that whomever the dealer appoints into that role, that we can give them the skill sets to know the duties that they're responsible for from A to Z.
So they're not going to just be going into this blind. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's
Perfect.
correct. We help them get qualified.
Another item that we've talked about is conduct both a paper and digital risk assessment in the entire dealership. Would you elaborate on that, please?
Of course. So when the rule was first passed in 2003, which seems like an eternity, when you look at the operation of a dealership in 2003 compared to 2022, one thing that has become abundantly obvious is the level of technology and sophistication that dealers now use each and every day to conduct their business. So in 2003, so we're almost 20 years ago, you know, there was, as I like to call it, it was the iPhone 5. Now we're in the iPhone 13. So it's a whole different animal. And so when we talk about paper and digital, in 2003, many dealerships still operated with more paper than digital in terms of they're conducting all their transactions. Now, they've always had dealer management systems, but the introduction of technology, cloud services, CRMs, on and on and on and on, dealerships now really are technology companies. So how does that translate? On the paper side, it's still business as usual. Some dealers will grab customer information and on a credit application, a paper credit application, as an example, while others will do it in a digital environment. Both of those create challenges for the dealership to manage in a safe and secure manner. So when we talk about paper and digital, it's clear what the FTC is after now, the emphasis on digital. They're not ignoring paper, but the predominant way dealers are conducting business, especially since the pandemic created this advancement with interacting with customers because of the nature of the pandemic, the digital interaction is become much more pronounced at the dealership level. So things like making sure that their technology infrastructure is itemized and they've got a clear understanding of each and every piece of technology, hardware in the dealership. That the dealer also has done its due diligence on making sure that multi-factor authentication, as an example, is put into play in the technology space that they're using. In addition, the FTC is going to go after making sure that the assessment includes an incident response plan. Again, these are very clear specifics, just like the word qualified. And an incident response plan is really the roadmap for a dealership to follow when they get compromised from a bad actor in their digital space. So it's always easier to respond when you plan than it is when it's a fire drill. So they're examples of the change to the tone and the change to the specifics. I'm just giving you a few of them. On the digital side, they're going to want to see phishing testing, PH, not the FIS. So they're going to want to see that the dealership is proactive on making sure that their team members at the dealer level, in all departments, aren't, opening up malware now that sets up shop to compromise customers' information in the digital world. Many dealers have IT departments that they either, work for them or they use a third party. So, the advice we give is you really need to get them into this game here, because they're going to have to make sure operating systems are up to date. Digital logs are kept for who's allowed to see what information, and all of this activity in the digital space needs to be documented. So when we talk about audits, as we've always talked about them, that notion of providing documentation so that you can provide it to a regulator in the event they're looking for it. If you don't document it, it never happened. And so this becomes a real challenge for dealers who, since 2003, have largely not either appointed a person in charge, qualified or not, and then have done very little in terms of auditing their operation, either paper or digital. And so everything that goes on today in our retail environment for dealers, the digital impact is huge. In Armed, we added and rebooted a new training module in the e-sign act. That e-sign act was passed in 2000. So why?
It's not new, huh?
It's not new, but it's a new activity for dealers. And so dealers have now pretty much, for the most part, moved into e-contracting, but that's relatively new in comparison to other industries, the mortgage industry, the retail stores that you might go to in your local town, et cetera, the Lowe's, the Home Depots, the Walmarts, who have had all that. So, when we talk about all of this, we want to be mindful that they want documentation. They want to make sure your digital space, your footprint, is managed from a risk assessment, and that you have periodic evaluations of this. Our recommendation on audits is, if you do them quarterly or more frequently than that, you're more likely to find problems that are small versus waiting once a year while they become big and unmanageable. So it's much easier to manage this on a more frequent basis. And what you'll find is the culture in the store now starts to change to embrace it, and it becomes a real important way for us to build trust with our customers because we're protecting their information. It's a huge gain for the dealers, and they should embrace it.
We've talked in previous podcasts, Michael, about policies, procedures, training, auditing.
Yes.
I know there are some dealerships out there that have basically they're just putting their heads in the sand and thinking, I won't, I don't have to worry about this. I'm going to be okay. And that's not the case, is it?
No, it is not. Not only is it not the case, but the cost that the dealers get exposed to in this rule are just a tad under $44,000 per violation per day.
Wow.
Per day. And in the legal business, we also say that the attorneys like their trump card, which is class action lawsuits. What does that mean? Typically, most dealers follow the privacy policy that was put out by the FTC, using it in their dealership as a method to communicate to the customer how they handle their non-public information and whether they share it with third parties or not. On that document, on the back side of that document, it's a 2-page document. Typically, they print it front and back, is a statement that says the dealer follows this rule, the safeguard rule. So in fact, if you follow it on that document that you're giving to your customer, and that's your document in the dealership, that now becomes negligence on the part of the dealership by not following what they've documented as their policy, which is following the safeguard rule. So if they don't do this legitimately and document it, you said you do it and you don't. And when you get into harm's way, we now open the basket up for unfair and deceptive acts and abusive practices, or UDAP, which adds to the cost.
Wow.
And fines.
Another area that we've talked about, Mike, and if you would elaborate on this, manage and risk assess all vendors with whom you share your customers' information.
Right. So what this new update to the safeguard rule from 2003 has done is it's identified and recognized this notion of who's included in this. Vendors have always been included in this. So any vendor with whom the dealer shares customer information is the responsibility of the dealership to make sure that they understand the operations that that vendor have in place, or the steps or the safeguards that they have in place at the vendor level, so that the dealer's best interests are served when they share the dealer's information to that vendor. So if the vendor doesn't follow standard practices for safeguarding customer information, the dealer's at risk for that. The expansion of this notion of vendors really became something called finders in the new rule. And they're recognizing institutions that in the past were you know, they probably were assumed or included. This time what they did is they said, you know what, we're going to make it de facto. What does that mean? Well, the reach of financial institutions or finders under the safeguard rule really include entities that are involved in banking, brokering, or servicing loans, or extending credit. So how does that translate for the dealer environment? Any of the lead generation companies that are out there with whom the dealers are doing business, any of these companies that are doing soft pulls, they're all now lumped into this same ruling, and the dealer's got to manage them. And so what we've learned over time is that dealers don't spend enough time knowing the operation of the vendor. In our business, in Armed, we have a questionnaire if the dealer doesn't know how the vendor operates, so they can ask them the right questions and assess whether or not that vendor presents a risk to the dealership under the 2003 rule and the new rule, so that they can be proactive. We also have resources for the dealership in our audit to make sure each and every one of the areas in the digital space are looked at and reviewed, so that they can document the areas now that this rule kind of has blossomed into from 2003. So the new news is, it's old news, except we moved from the iPhone 5 to the iPhone 13. And I'm not, supporting Apple. I'm just making a comment about technology and its impact to the dealer environment in today's business climate with respect to this new rule and what dealers have to abide by. And listen, the dealers have been very healthy these last couple of years in spite of all of the obstacles that we've all faced. And we're still facing, frankly, with the inventory issue and the integrated chip. However, their balance sheets are strong. We want to keep them strong. We like our dealer friends to keep the money, not lease the money. This is a very, very, very manageable function for the dealers to embrace and protect themselves and their business.
Well, that's perfect. You touched on it just a minute ago, but if you would again, just kind of summarize then, what are the consequences if a dealership chooses to sweep this under the rug, decides, I'm not going to worry about that right now. I've got other things to worry about.
Right. Well, the fines are $43,972, and every year they go up and are indexed to inflation, and we know where inflation is, right? Okay, so it's not flat anymore; it's going north. So I would suspect that we can start it, and I'm just rounding the numbers because it's easier to use 44,000 times each violation. So every credit app that's left around, every audit that's not done, every PC that's not protected, every database that's not protected, any document that isn't properly disposed of, including digitally when there's no longer a business need, all of that's subjected to this. And all the vendors with whom you share this information, you can do the math pretty quickly. And as I stated earlier, if we don't pay attention to this, yet we're pretty consistent on giving a privacy policy out to our customers, that privacy policy says you do one thing and you don't, that's an unfair, deceptive act and practice. So that's a UDAP, that's a class action lawsuit waiting to happen. Sky's the limit on that. Here's what'll happen. It'll put them out of business, plain and simple. And frankly, this is such a manageable solution. And, our company Armed has had all of the resources that dealers have needed on this rule for the last 2.5 years. We knew this was coming. We knew the iPhone 13 was coming.
Well, Mike, as we finish up, I do want to touch on one area, and it's a conversation that you and I had a couple of days ago, where we talked about, again, privacy of customers and things like that. But you brought up a really interesting point on vehicles being traded in and reconditioned, and some of the things that dealers should be doing as far as that reconditioning process goes that they probably have not even thought about as far as customer privacy.
Yeah, so this notion of customer privacy takes on kind of a new term. We call it a new term, and frankly, you can look back to the Sony Entertainment hack. That's where I think the shift began. When the rule was crafted in 2003, this notion of non-public information, NPI, was included in that ruling. What's changed with the Sony email hack, where the bad actors got into their digital space and compromised their email functions, really set the pace for even the privacy laws that California has now been adopting, Europe's been adopting, which is any unique personal information, email, phone number, even if it's not considered non-public, should be safeguarded. When we talk about that, that means everything that customer touches. You brought up vehicles. Well, automobiles have all the technology in the world, and what we tend to do is we tend to put for convenience purposes, we use a navigation system, we have a phone directory, we have Bluetooth, and all of that is stored in those vehicles. So when the dealer takes title to that, guess who owns that? The dealer. So we want to be mindful that this thing is just not non-public information, but uniquely personal information, even if it's something that you might be able to find in the public domain on the internet. Because with respect to telephone numbers, right? They print them up sometimes on repair orders, and they'll handwrite it. The advisor will for the tech. They'll handwrite the customer's cell number because that's where they're at that day. And so they're going to call them when the car's done. The RO follows the tech back into the shop, just like the phone directory in cars. Now what happens is, if that gets into the hands of a bad actor, we have people that create spoofing. It's a piece of it's a buzzword in technology. It's essentially they're going to mimic your phone number or a similar phone number, and you're going to get spammed, and you're going to get all of these unwanted calls, and they turn into disasters for some people. And so that kind of information is never good to leave unnoticed and not protected or safeguarded, wherever it is, automobiles or any department in the dealership. We just know that as we move further, even into the electric vehicle space, just cars become yet another extension of customer information at the dealer level. Protect it, get rid of it, move on, make it part of your best practices at the store.
So when we're taking in a trade-in, one of the things completely clear all the information that's stored in there as far as telephone numbers, things like that, even down to the navigation, because they could actually go to a person's home and with the garage door opener, open up their home.
Yes. So, there's some companies that have bubbled up in our space in the market that do this, provide a service, you pay them for it. That's fine. We don't, have any axe to grind there. We think that that's a good service if it makes sense for the dealer. What, as a best practice for me and our family, when we buy and sell cars, we don't leave the dealership until the car we've traded is initialized. That's just something we've always done. I'm not so sure that that's a best practice or it's understood at the dealer level if they're taking off-lease cars, trade-ins, or buying them from the auctions. But again, there's some companies out there in the software space that will do that. But again, it needs to be done. So the point I think to make here is the safeguard rule continues to expand and include include more than non-public information. So, this, again, our industry shifting and morphing, and technology is a big part of it. So the risk to dealers continues to grow every time a new piece of technology shows up. So managing the vendors, as an example, we talked about that a moment ago, takes on a whole new meaning here. And generally speaking, the dealers are going to need to review their policies, procedures, their risk assessment, produce that incident response plan, and appoint a qualified individual to oversee all of this. Now, as you know, from the years that we've been doing business together with your clients, that this is a sliver of what we do. The safeguard rule is one piece of it. And we've covered in this podcast a lot of information. So the qualified individual really has, to be someone who can deal with not only this, but all the other regulations that dealers must meet. This is the new news, though.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for this information. Again,
my pleasure.
Very, very valuable information. Thanks for talking with us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. And
my pleasure as well.
And thanks to everyone for attending this podcast.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.